60 souls went missing on the Obra Dinn, each with their own names, faces, and fates. But who were these people? Let's take a deeper look into their time on the Obra Dinn, starting with the first name on the manifest, Captain Robert Witterel. Robert Witterel first appears in Chapter 3, giving orders for the execution of Hoscut Lao, one of the Formosan passengers, for the murder of another passenger. The subsequent failed mutinous expedition of the real murderer, second mate Edward Nichols, led to the deaths of the other Formosan passengers and set into motion a series of events that would eventually lead to the demise of the Obra Dinn. When the bodies of Edward Nichols and the two Formosan passengers were being hauled on board, Robert Witterel began to interrogate the sole surviving Formosan, Chiu Tan, and learn about the existence of a shell in the chest. At this moment, one of the mermaids that they hauled up from Nichols' boats started shooting spikes at the crew, killing Tan and another crew member while narrowly missing Witterel himself. While Witterel was on deck discussing the situation with his officers, the mermaids were being moved into the ship's hold, in the process causing the deaths of two more crew members. Then he learned that his steward, Philip Dahl, cut off the leg of one of the seamen while attempting to get into the lazaret where the mermaids were being held, yelling about a curse and trying to free the mermaids. Angry and frustrated, Witterel ordered Dahl to be locked up in the lazaret with the mermaids. This is easy to overlook in light of the events to come, but imagine the state of mind that Witterel must have been in by this point. In the span of maybe a few days, a passenger was murdered, two VIP passengers showed up dead after his second mate mutinied and kidnapped them, his second mate and another 5 members of the crew dead in the process, and after that, another 5 deaths literally minutes ago. And now, just after the betrayal of the second mate, his own steward, who has served him faithfully for the last 20 years, has turned on him as well. The amount of stress and shock he was experiencing must have been incredible. It would not be long before things took a turn for the worse. 2 terrifying monsters riding spider crabs boarded the ship and killed many of the crew before they were finally taken down. As the crew members desperately tried to fight off these monsters, Robert Witterel could be seen coming down from the upper decks, sword in hand, ordering the crew to secure the hold. Although Witterel is not seen during the Kraken attack, he certainly knew about the attack, and he's known to have been in the holds while the crew were desperately fighting the monster. Believing that the mermaids summoned the Kraken, he went into the lazaret and threatened the mermaids, killing 2 of them. And it appears that the plan worked, because the Kraken did stop its attack. So he went up on deck, telling the others that it was he who drove the Kraken away, only to learn that his wife had died. Again, just imagine the emotional roller coaster that Witterel went through. He was furious when he went down to confront the mermaids during the Kraken attack, but was it truly at the mermaids and the Kraken that he was angry at? Deep down, was he angry at the Formosan passengers for being the catalyst? Was he angry at Edward Nichols for the mutiny and for bringing the mermaids to the ship? Was he angry at his steward for his betrayal? Or was he angry at himself for being ultimately the man who made the call to bring the mermaids on board and is now trying to make amends for it? Whatever the reason, he was angry when he went into the cargo hold and took out that anger on the mermaids in a violent manner. He was likely desperate as well, because he knew they didn't stand a chance against the Kraken, just grasping at straws in despair, doing the only thing that he thought maybe would save his ship. But it worked, and at that moment, he must have been immensely proud of what he had done. Even though many people had died, he had saved the ship and the remaining people on board. And it was him, Robert Witterel, who fought off that massive godforsaken Kraken. So he walks up on deck, maybe skipping a little bit in joy, only to be brought down to earth and more by the sight of the broken body of his wife. Maybe this is what influenced him to do what he did in Chapter 9, Escape. The ship's surgeon, Henry Evans, 2 female passengers, and 2 officers' stewards boarded the last remaining boat, but they were interrupted by topman Leonid Volkov. Witterel orders Volkov to let them go and brandishes his gun in warning, but he's too late to stop Volkov from killing one of the stewards. It's not clear whether Witterel knew about the group's plan beforehand, but even if he didn't, he effectively gave his blessings by virtue of his actions. It seems more likely than not that he was in the know, because it doesn't seem like the 2 stewards would have taken action without the consent of their officers, and First Mate William Hoscut also did nothing to try to stop the boat from leaving. Perhaps this was his way of making amends, trying to save the last civilians on board, after failing to protect the other passengers and his wife. We see him lean against the railing, indicating just how much of a toll the events have taken on him. And finally, the end. With only 4 people left on the ship, First Mate William Hoscut and the 2 other remaining crew members plan a mutiny, apparently influenced by the shells that the mermaids were carrying. Claiming to have thrown the remaining shells into the sea, Witterel kills the mutineers, including Hoscut, who was his brother-in-law and close friend. At last, Robert Witterel was the last man left alive on the ship. Overcome with guilt, grief, and despair, there was only one thing left for him to do. He took his own life with a gun next to the body of his beloved wife. To add insult to injury, the epilogue indicates that his estate was confiscated, most likely due to English laws on suicide at the time. At first glance, Robert Witterel seems like a jerk. He was certainly flawed, he was arrogant, and he was autocratic. But in these aspects, he was really no worse than any other captain of his time. He genuinely thought he was doing the right thing, and ultimately, his tragedy was not of his own doing. Just as the rest of the crew, he was victim to events that he could neither control nor comprehend. The captain of a ship is responsible for every single soul on it, and the deaths of so many crew members and passengers could not have been easy on a man who, for all his failings, most certainly had a conscience. He had no reason to suspect anything when he chose to bring the mermaids on board, even with the freak deaths that occurred immediately afterwards. When things started to go wrong, Witterel tried to make things right, and in a way, he succeeded. The 4 survivors of the Obra Dinn survived in no small part because of his actions. Although the mermaid shells seem to exert an influence on some of the crew members' minds, it's unclear how much impact they had on Witterel. It does not seem like his actions were ever motivated by desire or obsession for the shells. Bringing the mermaids on board seemed entirely reasonable at the time. He did not know about the shells, and he was quite focused on trying to find out what had happened. Killing the mermaids was both an act of anger and a desperate attempt to save the ship. And it's notable that after he did that, he did not take the 3rd shell that was still visible in the hold. His actions in the final chapter may seem erratic, but can you blame him? After being betrayed by his 2nd officer, then by his steward of 20 years, after having lost his wife, the man that he trusted more than anyone else, the one man who should have been grieving for Abigail together with him, had turned on him as well, demanding the shells. Maybe this was the last straw that made him snap? Or maybe he had realized what the shells did and understood there was no way back for Hoscut. His confession and suicide suggest that he did not plan to keep the shells to himself. We'll never know. All we know is that Captain Robert Witterel died a broken man, knowing that the death of his entire crew occurred on his watch, his only consolation being that he would not have to live any longer in a world without his beloved wife. Ultimately, of all the stories on the Obra Dinn, Captain Robert Witterel's story may be the most tragic of them all. That's for the recap of Captain Robert Witterel. Next time, we'll be back to talk about his first mate and brother-in-law, William Hoscut. Thank you for watching, and see you again.